Okay, we are back with Read Aloud, and when we left off our last chapter, we had that typical Peter and the Starcatchers chapter where we had two groups kind of going back and forth. It was a longer chapter. We had Peter trying to get away from the skeleton, and with the help of Leonard, they were able to do that. But the question that remains is what happened to Leonard as a result. The next two chapters are going to be pretty enjoyable because there's two big reveals of previous characters that we've known from other books that I think you'll be excited to see. And then, of course, you also have some holes filled in on some of the mysteries, particularly with possibly Cheeky O'Neill and company. So two really pretty good chapters to start things off. Chapter 47 is called The Launch. The engine crew of the steamer Nimbus had seen their captain only once on this voyage. He was a last-minute replacement for Captain Peel, a fair and well-liked sailor who had commanded the Nimbus for 12 years. But just before sailing, Mr. Peel and his regular officers and deckhands had all taken ill with a strange sleeping sickness. Only the 4 engineers working far below decks remained from the original crew. The Nimbus was lucky to have them. Its twin engines were quirky, prone to problems that only 4 engineers understood how to fix. They came to wonder if they were spared the illness because of this knowledge. The one time they met their new captain had been enough. It was just before casting off he had come down to the engine room and told them in a brief, snarling speech that he didn't want them to associate with the rest of the crew. That was fine with them. They wanted no part of the new crew if they were anything like the new captain. The new captain was old. He had a weather-ravaged face, and his dark eyes were set in a permanent glare. The worst of all was his nose, or his lack of one. He wore a beak of gray wood tied around his head, covering a hole in the center of his face. Sometimes when he spoke, the hole emitted a deep whistling noise, like the hoot of an owl. The captain's name was Nereza. After the Nimbus left port, the engine crew had almost no contact with anyone, except on the ship. Their only communication was the captain, and it came in the form of orders barked down a voice pipe from the bridge to the engine room. Occasionally the engineers ventured up on deck, but the new crew made it clear that they were unwelcome, so they never stayed long. They were not told where the ship was going or why. One day, in the middle of the ocean, the Nimbus stopped, and through a porthole the engine crew caught a glimpse of a small dinghy being lowered with 4 men aboard. After that, for many days, the Nimbus seemed to travel in a huge circle, many miles in diameter. They were out of sight of whatever they were circling, but the men in the engine room had spotted a small, persistent cloud on the horizon. They figured they would be circling an island day after day, but why? Some kind of smuggling was Chief Wilkie's guess. The other 3 were inclined to agree. This Nereza was a bad man. That much they were sure of, and of the men, they said they once heard a story about Captain No-Nose, who sailed to England with a ghost as cargo. The others insisted they didn't believe in ghosts, but this story stayed with the men, and more they avoided the upper decks. All they wanted to do was get off of the ship alive. But when? Endless days followed endless nights, with the Nimbus always circling. And then one day, some black smudges of smoke appeared in the sky, and the ship came alive. The crew readied the odd launch, and they had been loaded aboard the Nimbus just before she sailed. A sturdy-looking 6-oar rowboat with a cargo space amidships. The engine crew had wondered what its purpose was, and even more mysterious was the launch's cargo. 4 crates hauled up from the forward hold. The engine crew speculated on what was in the crates. Gold was one theory. At sunset, the ship turned toward the cloud on the horizon, and Nereza's command came down. "All ahead 1/4. Runner quiet, no new coal." The engine crew knew what this meant. Nereza had let the boilers build up heat, and now they could propel the ship forward at a slow pace without so much as a puff of smoke coming out of her stacks. It became night, and hours passed. The ship steamed quietly. All of her lights was out. Then she stopped. The engine crew heard activity above and went to the portholes, and by the dim moonlight they watched as the launch was lowered. There was a man at each oar and one at the tiller. "Take a close look at the tiller, men," said Wilkie. The others squinted through the portholes and gasped. The man at the tiller was Captain Nereza. He gave a hand signal, and the 6 men pulled smoothly on the oars. The launch slipped away from the Nimbus into the night. "That's 2 boats that we've lowered. Where are they going?" "I don't know," said Wilkie, "but wherever it is, there's gonna be trouble." and that's the end of the chapter. So you kind of have to take this chapter and connect it to the puzzle piece of what's been going on the island with the gentlemen from the island that were sending the smoke signal. That connects to what we see in this chapter, where the smoke from the island is seen by the men on the boat, and they now know that they should come back to the island. So Nereza is creeping his way back to the island at nighttime, and we will see what he is up to. The next chapter is chapter 48, and it also reunites you with some familiar faces. The driver of the horse-drawn taxicab was initially reluctant to take the odd-looking passengers, especially Peter wearing nothing but rags and Wendy missing a shoe. But when Neville handed the driver a pound note, he quickly relented, allowing the 6 of them to squeeze into a cab, with John and Michael terrified from their encounter with the skeleton sitting on Mrs. Bumbrake's ample lap. Peter was still in pain, and he needed Wendy's help to climb in. He sat in silence, looking down. The taxicab rumbled through the dark streets for 15 minutes, then stopped in front of the narrow 3-story building on a quiet street near Sloane Square called Draycott Place. Neville looked at the building doubtfully. It was completely dark, not a glimmer of light showing in any of its windows. "Are you certain that's it?" said the driver. He pointed to the sign, Scotland Landing Hotel, no vacancy. Okay, remember, vacancy is kind of confusing. If a sign says no vacancy, it means there are no rooms available. If hotel has vacancy, it means there are rooms available. So what they're saying is there are no rooms available in the hotel. "I've passed this hotel 1,000 times," said the driver. "It never has a vacancy." "Really?" said Neville. "You sure this is where you want to go?" "We are," said Wendy, before Neville could answer, and they piled out of the taxicab, and Neville paid the driver, who flicked the reins and disappeared into the night. Wendy approached the door and tried the knob. It was locked. There was no doorbell button or pull rope, so she knocked 3 times. There was no answer. She tried again and again, each time pounding harder, and still getting no response. "I'm cold," said Michael. "Me too," said John. "Maybe we should find another hotel," said Neville. "No, Grandfather told me to come here," said Wendy. "We need to be someplace safe with the police looking for us." "They'll find us anyway if we're standing out here in the street," observed Mrs. Bumbrake. Wendy knocked again. Still no answer. "There must be somebody here. Why don't they just answer the door?" Just then the door opened and out poked an enormous head. It belonged to an equally enormous man with a wild mane of white hair flowing into a bushy white beard. Peter was sure he'd seen this man before, but he couldn't quite think of where. And you've met this man before in Shadow Thieves, so think about who you believe it might be. "Can't you see the sign?" the man growled. "There's no—" His eyes fell on Peter. "Hold on." He stepped out, and his shoulders were so wide they barely fit through the door. He was barefoot, wearing only a nightgown the size of a tent. He moved closer to Peter, peering down into his face, then nodded. "You were the boy at Stonehenge. Remember me?" "And you were at Lord Astor's country house," Peter said. "You're the man with the animals." The man grinned, his beard parting to reveal a set of huge white teeth. "That I am. McGill's my name, and you are—" "Peter." That's right, Peter. Still a boy after all these years." He didn't appear to be surprised by this. "Who are your friends, Peter?" "My name is Wendy Darling. I'm Leonard Astor's granddaughter." McGill's eyes brightened. "And how is Lord Astor?" Wendy hesitated. There's been some trouble." McGill's smile disappeared. "Oh, come right in." They entered the hotel, and McGill, after bolting the door, led them down a hallway into a drawing room. It had a pungent, musky aroma and was quite dark, the only light coming from a few glowing coals by the fireplace. In the far corner of laid a massive figure even larger than McGill and remarkably hairy, dozing off in an oversized chair, snoring loudly. Bonus if you know what animal is in the chair, and even better if you remember his name from Starcatchers. It's Carl. "Don't mind Carl," said McGill. Carl, thought Peter. Somehow he knew that name. Uncle Neville stepped close to the sleeping form and looked at it. "My word, is that a—" A bear, said Peter, remembering. Oh, dear, said Mrs. Bumbrake, pulling Michael and John closer. You have a bear in your hotel, said Wendy. It's not really a hotel. We never have any guests. After Lord Astor became too ill to travel to his country house, he brought me here to London to be close by, just in case. And you brought Carl? Oh, of course I did. Couldn't very well leave him up there alone at his age, now could I? But he's a bear, said Wendy. He behaves a lot better than most Londoners. You keep him inside all the time? I take him out sometimes, and at night he wears a coat and a hat. We stick to darker areas. Sometimes we visit the wolves in Hyde Park. The wolves? Said Wendy. Yeah, they come down occasionally from Salisbury Plain to visit, although they don't want to live here. In the corner chair, Carl, apparently awakened by the noise, shifted his massive form and opened his eyes. He looked around the room at the visitors, then emitted a deep, rumbling growl. It's all right, Carl. He made a growling sound of his own, and Carl, apparently satisfied, resumed dozing. McGill turned to Wendy. We've talked enough about my situation. Tell me about Lord Astor and this trouble. As quickly as she could, Wendy summarized what had happened. Grandfather said we must stop them. That's why I went to get Peter, but now we've returned and it seems my father's gone missing too. Mrs. Bumbrake said he's not been seen in days. We can't go to the police. Von Schotten controls them. Just now we barely escaped my grandfather's house. The police came with this horrible creature who very nearly killed Peter. Had it not been for grandfather's fighting him, we'd not be here. Lord Astor fought? Bravely, and he saved us, glancing at Peter, who was looking down. She decided not to tell McGill about his scream. For a moment, the room was silent, except for a long, rumbling snore from Carl. Then McGill said, If Lord Astor sent you here for help, you're going to get it. What do you need? Wendy looked at Peter. We don't really know. That makes it a little more difficult. Uncle Neville, who had been listening intently, explained the situation and cleared his throat. Seems to me that if we want to stop this Von Schotten fellow from opening the cache, it would be helpful to know where the cache is so we could try to prevent him from getting to it. Yeah, but we don't know where it is. All we know is that grandfather said something about confess. Confess what? Said Neville. We don't know. I see, said Neville. Then the other way to stop Von Schotten would be to prevent him from using the sword as the key. How? Well, if I understand you correctly, said Uncle Neville, the sword will open the cache only if the tip has been reattached. That's what grandfather said. Then maybe we can get the tip ourselves, said Neville. But we don't know where it is, and Von Schotten may already have it. Spoiler alert, we know he has it because we remember that from early in the book, but they don't know that. Yes, I assume he does, but until the coronation, the Sword of Mercy will be locked away in the tower with the other crown jewels. Meanwhile, the tip is likely somewhere here in London, awaiting reattachment. Maybe we could get to it first. How? Said Peter. I don't know, said Neville. I'm just looking for areas of weakness that might be attacked. It would be helpful if we knew something about the tip or how it would be reattached. Would it be a job for a blacksmith? I don't know, said Wendy. But I know somebody who might. Uncle Ted. Ted? Said Peter. His colleague, actually. A fellow at Cambridge. Uncle Ted said he was an expert on the Sword of Mercy, and he knew about the missing tip. It sounds as if it might be a good idea to get in touch with that fellow, said Neville. We could call Uncle Ted on the telephone, said Wendy. If we had a telephone. There's a telephone here, said McGill. Here? In the parlor. Lord Astor had it installed just in case. Never used it myself. I don't know how. What's a telephone? Said Peter. So keep in mind, this is right around the time of the invention of the telephone. Bonus points if you can look up and find out who invented the telephone. But it's kind of a new device, so imagine it as any of the kind of new technology that we've seen in the past couple of years, cell phones, smartphones, tablets, Disney Plus, whatever. Oh, it's a marvelous device, said Neville. Sound causes a metal diaphragm to vibrate. This in turn causes fluctuations in electrical current passing through carbon granules. Clever. What's a telephone? Said Peter. I'll show you, said Wendy, and she went to the parlor. After a minute of silence, John asked McGill, What does your bear eat? Well, he used to eat mostly berries, nuts, insects, and the occasional small animal, but since we moved to London, he's become quite fond of fish and chips. Fish and chips is fried fish, and then chips are what people from England refer to as French fries. So he really likes French fries. We just happen to call them French fries. They call them chips. How does he get them, said John. Oh, I buy them from a local chippy. Carl can eat a dozen or so orders at a time and still want more. In fact, one night I left the door unlocked and he went out looking for more. Good thing I found him before he found the chippy. McGill laughed heartily. Seeing the non-amused expression on Mrs. Bumbrake's face, he stopped abruptly, then said, It seems you're going to be staying here at the Scotland Landing. What sort of room do you prefer? I prefer a room that is as far from a bear as possible. And that's the end of the chapter. So a little bit longer, but I think it was worth it to have those two chapters together so we could see the return of Nereza and also McGill and Carl. So we've got some interesting questions that need answering in the next couple chapters, and tomorrow we will be back with Baron von Schatten.